The Steelers have made a trade, and the best news ever involving Damar Hamlin and some interesting draft notes. We're loaded here on a Wednesday edition of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi again, and welcome in to Locked On NFL. He's Lorin Cox in for Tony Wiggins this week. I'm James Rapien, and thank you so much for making us your first listen. Whether you're subscribing on YouTube or following wherever you get your podcasts, thanks for being a part of that everyday club. We certainly appreciate each and every one of you. And like I said, there's a lot to dive into. First things first, and it's about as good of news, Lorin, as you could ask for. And I think dating way back to January at Paycor Stadium when Damar Hamlin was on the field, this is really the best case scenario. Damar Hamlin officially cleared for football activities and expected to play and get back on the field. And I love it. I don't really have much more to say other than I'm really excited for him, and I hope he makes a bunch of plays for the Bills this season. But this is certainly a best case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, given how scary it was at that time, and I know you were even actually there to see how that process worked, to be able to get to this point is really encouraging. And I know they've sort of finalized more of a diagnosis on what happened. It was the same sort of thing we hear about with youth players getting hit in the chest and it disrupting the heartbeat and the heart rhythm. Like, that's a diagnosis that I know kind of has to come by eliminating a bunch of other options. And so for Hamlin to come out and say, like, yes, that's what we think happened to me, indicates that, okay, we can rule out a lot more other, like, potentially more dangerous, more scary outcomes that could have been something bigger or worse in his body and in his life. So really happy for him all around to have what is, I guess, as positive as a diagnosis as you can have, given how serious of a situation it was.
You're right. I was there, and it was obviously unprecedented. There's been so much coverage, but seeing it in person and being like, oh, because you see players. You've been to countless games. That's part of what we do. You see players get hurt all the time and carted off. And it was just much, much different. And obviously in the moment, you didn't know exactly what was going on. And no, it's really cool. I was at the Bills-Bengals game when he returned, and he was in the stadium. And I was probably 10 feet away from him during the pregame. And so the fact that he's going to be able to take the field again this season, I hope he just dominates and has a breakout year. But great news there. So congrats to Damar Hamlin. Really excited for him. And the other thing, and it was a surprise to me, the Pittsburgh Steelers trading for a veteran wide receiver that a lot of people think is washed. But Allen Robinson, assuming he passes a physical with the Steelers, which is expected to take place on Wednesday, is set to become the latest Steelers wide receiver. Now, you covered Allen when he was in Chicago for a bit and had a down year last year. I think that's safe to say. 33 receptions, just over 300 yards, 3 touchdowns for the Rams. The Rams essentially eating 10 of his $15 million that's owed, and they're swapping 7th rounders in this deal. So it's not like there's any real compensation for the Rams, but they save $5 million. Did this deal surprise you? And do you think Allen Robinson has anything left? Because I just assume Pittsburgh's going to lock and load at wide receiver and reload in the draft. And it doesn't look that way this year with trading for a guy like Robinson.
Yeah, I think for Pittsburgh, you've got a young wide receiving core there with a lot of upside, but guys like Calvin Austin and George Pickens, they drafted last year, and Deontay Johnson is still on the younger side of the spectrum there. So I can see for them trying to get a veteran like Robinson, who's somehow been in the league for 9 years and is still only like 29 years old, not quite 30 yet. Like, it feels weird to be talking about a guy who's washed, and presumably, I mean, the evidence on the field kind of speaks for itself, but like, it's weird that he's so young because he's been in the league for so long, and that's kind of always been the story for him. The joke is always like, oh wow, blank player is still only 1 year younger than Allen Robinson, and Robinson is blank years older than this old rookie coming out of the draft. But at the same time, he hasn't been able to play a 16-game season since his best year in Chicago in 2020. He's been injured. He's been in some ineffective offenses at times as they've had quarterback situations, and certainly in Chicago, and with injuries in with the Rams last season. Like, if you feel like there's always that ability there, but it feels like the same story we talked about at the end of his time in Chicago. Like, where's the guy who was a 1,400-yard, 14-touchdown receiver in Jacksonville his second season?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he gets back to being a 1,000-yard guy for a little bit, and now he's back down again. It's like, for the second time in his career, can he get back to being that 1,000-yard guy? It's sort of a fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. I don't know if we can quite get back there again.
And there's competition, and it's competition with his quarterback, which it seems like always happens. But Kenny Pickett is an unknown at this point, and Steelers fans might get mad about that, but I think that that's fair to say of him right now. And you have Deontay Johnson, who I think is a solid wide receiver, pretty, low end number one, if you want to look at it that way. And then George Pickens, who is just oozing with talent, and I think has a chance to be a really darn good player in this league. So where does Robinson fit? I think there's part of it there. And maybe we've reached another stage of his career, because there were some that were bullish on him last year ahead of his first season, his only season with the Rams. And it just didn't work out for a bunch of reasons. Maybe he's more of a supporting actor in this Steelers offense and more of a third option. And if that's the case, maybe it could pan out and be a successful trade.
And I can hear the Allen Robinson hopefuls, though, saying, okay, last year he was catching passes from a little bit of Matthew Stafford, but a lot of like Baker Mayfield, John Wolford, injured quarterbacks. The year before that in Chicago was Justin Fields' rookie season, where, there was still Andy Dalton was playing some of the games there, and they eventually kind of went over to Fields. And then, when he actually had a little bit more consistent play with Mitch Trubisky of all QBs, he actually had some decent production in Chicago. So, if Kenny Pickett and that Steelers offense can be a little bit better and a little bit more concrete this season, could this be the circumstances that are great for Allen Robinson? But at the same time, plenty of truly great receivers are still able to produce when the quarterback play isn't ideal, and that hasn't always been the case for Robinson.
It's a perfect segue. You mentioned great receivers. I don't think there are many great receivers in this draft. I like Jackson Smith and Jigba a lot, but overall, I think it's kind of a weak draft at wide receiver. And maybe this is why the Steelers make this move. They say $5 million for a guy that we think can be a supporting actor in our offense, versus I see some quality slot players. But if you're not taking a receiver, named Jackson Smith and Jigba, I know some people like Jordan Addison. I'm not as high on him. Quentin Johnston. I mean, there's not many studs to me. And so if that's the case, maybe you decide, all right, let's bring in a guy like Allen Robinson. Let's dive into some draft talk, and maybe I'll get your thoughts on wide receiver in this draft as a whole, from a depth standpoint, talent standpoint. And then we can talk about Bijan Robinson, because I think he's got the talent, but he might be waiting for a while. We'll dive into that and so much more coming up next here on Locked On NFL. But today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book. And whether it's grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays, well, Major League Baseball is back. And that's why you got to get to FanDuel, because you're going to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. And it's not just baseball. Oh, no. The NBA playoffs in full swing right now. So maybe you think LeBron James is going to continue their second half resurgence in LA, or maybe you think Golden State is done because they are down 2-0 against Sacramento. You can wager on all of those things, including same game parlays, to win even more money. Get your no sweat first bet right now with FanDuel.com/locked on. That's all you have to do, is go to FanDuel.com/locked on to get $1,000 in bonus bets back. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
Welcome back into this Wednesday edition of Locked On NFL, or excuse me, does this come out on Tuesday or Wednesday, James? I always get our days of the week mixed up here.
Oh, no, this is Wednesday. It comes out Tuesday night for most people, on
That's
YouTube, but yep.
This Wednesday edition of Locked On NFL, as I make it awkward coming out of the break, Lorin Cox from Locked On Bears filling in clearly for Tony Wiggins from Locked On Jaguars, along with James Rapien, who's your regular Wednesday host here. And as we get into this NFL draft class, James, you were teasing it ahead of time, and I find myself agreeing with you. And I thought about this from a Bears perspective on Locked On Bears too, that like if you're going to draft a wide receiver in this year's draft class, you got to get JSN in the first round, or everybody else has bigger question marks, red flags, things you feel like, man, I don't know if they're like plug and play going to be right at the top of my wide receiver lineup just yet. This class doesn't have the Jamar Chase at the top. It doesn't have that great talent at the top, but it is deep. But it's like it's a low quality depth, but not like it's quantity. It's quantity, but not quality. I think when it comes to this wide receiver class,
I think that's fair. And there are guys that are fun, right? Like I like Josh Downs. Zay Flowers is interesting to me. Jalen Hyatt is obviously a burn. Like they have places in the NFL, but it's such a weapons league in this day and age. And that's part of why your Bears landing DJ Moore in that deal, that's huge because I don't see many DJ Moores in this draft class. And of course you'd rather have 21-year-old DJ Moore on with under team control for at least 4 years on a rookie deal. Hard to find that. Jonathan Mingo's interesting. Like there are guys that have Marvin Mims, people might stand on the table for him. Tyler Scott, some have compared him, to some different burners and deep threats. It's, to me, they're all just okay. It's a small receiver class. In this draft as a whole, there's some good players at the top, but I'm trying to think of which GM said it. But there was a GM recently that said, oh yeah, we have some first round grades, but it gets like about halfway through. I bet there's like 15 first round graded players for some of these teams, and that's not ideal. So I think overall it's a weak draft, and certainly at wide receiver, it's one of the weakest drafts we've seen in quite some time.
Yeah, I feel like once you get like past, JSN, you can kind of start to put these guys into different categories in this sort of like, mid to late first to early second round range. I feel like there's a group of some of what you were talking about, like the small, fast receivers, like Zay Flowers, Josh Downs from North Carolina, Tyler Scott from Cincinnati. And then you have like the vertical downfield receivers that are a little bit more unpolished and tend to be a little bit bigger in terms of route running, like Quentin Johnston and Cedric Tillman from Tennessee, or even Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee is a little bit smaller, not as big as those two guys. But like all three of them are vertical receivers that don't run like a super robust route tree and aren't great route runners, but just know they can win downfield. And there's things to like about both of those groups, but like each one has some very clear flaws where it's like, okay, if I'm taking this guy, there's going to need to be I'm going to need to know the limitations that are there right away. And there's going to be a developmental curve there where it's like, if I'm a team, like if I'm super wide receiver needy, I'm going to pull the trigger, but it's not one of those drafts where it's just like, hey, load up on weapons for my quarterback just because wide receiver is the best player available and I just can always add more weapons. It's like, well, unless I really need one, I feel like I'm going to be finding my best players available in that late first to second round range, probably at other positions.
It was Brandon Beane, by the way, the Bills GM. Yeah. And yeah, he basically implied about 15. And he didn't say the word 15, but those first round grades disappear quickly, is his point. And they're drafting 27th. So we'll see what happens there. I know they've been tied to some different weapons in this draft class, from Zay Flowers to Bijan Robinson. And I don't know where you stand on him, but I certainly think he has a first round grade from all 32 teams, but it's that position value versus talent. I don't think the NFL views him as Saquon Barkley, like talent-wise. I think everyone has him as the best back in this class, or most teams, I would say. But I don't think people view him as this generational back. Really, really high-end one. Best back in this class, not Saquon as a prospect. So where does that rank? Where does that fall? Obviously, he'll probably go in round one. Where does he go, though? I think it's going to be interesting because he could be one of those guys that falls on draft night.
Yeah, it seems like every year it's tough with Bijan because we always feel like, okay, the running backs are going to fall, but it always just takes one team that like says, screw it, we value the running back, we want to make sure we get that guy, and it feels like there might be a general consensus opinion of like, yeah, probably should be mid to late round back, but then a lot of people keep saying the Atlanta Falcons, I think, are the betting favorite to take Bijan Robinson, or either they're the favorite team to take him, or he's the favorite to be their first round pick. I forgot which way the betting odds went on that in the top 10. And a lot of people connect him to the Philadelphia Eagles at 10 as well, although that doesn't strike me as a Howie Roseman positional value decision there. But again, it would take one of those teams just being the one that says, screw it, he's the best player available on our board, let's go get him, for him to avoid what could otherwise be a pretty significant fall. Because I think you see a lot of those teams in the early teens not necessarily being teams that you would expect to nab a running back in that situation, just based on either what we've seen from them in the team building perspective or what they already have on the roster. When I think about teams like the Tennessee Titans with Derrick Henry, or I think about the New England Patriots have never been going to be like big investing that early in a top running back, or the Packers have multiple running backs there. The Washington Commanders have some pretty talented young players in their backfield. So you can start to see this fall if he gets past teams like Atlanta and I guess maybe the Eagles in the top 10.
And some have said the Chargers, which I think is pretty interesting, because then what do you do with Eckler? I know he's in the last year of his deal, but eating into his carries in a contract year, assuming he's there and they don't trade him, that's tough. I don't know if that's necessarily the way you want to go. And after that, is it the Cowboys? Does he just stay in Texas? Do the Bills go that route? I agree. It's tough. I think he goes somewhere. Maybe it's a surprise team, but I'm pretty high on him. Like we've talked about it on Locked On Bengals sub. Like if he's there at 28, I don't really know how he's not the top player on your board, because so many things have to fall and top guys have to go. Like both tight ends would go that I would think are going for sure in round one. Dalton Kincaid and Michael Mayer. All these guys would have to go for him to fall to that part of the first round. What if he fell past Cincinnati? What if the Chiefs are faced with doing it again? And I know their backfield's really good, but it's Bijan Robinson. If he falls there, I know you landed a 7th rounder last year. I think it's really interesting. He probably doesn't get that far. But I also don't think he goes to Tampa either. I've seen him go to Tampa. I don't see that being a fit. They have a good young back there in Rachaad White.
Maybe the Minnesota Vikings, as they talk about maybe a Dalvin Cook departure. Could he be? I mean, their GM comes from a very strong analytics background, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah. So I don't know that he would want to be the guy to draft a running back in the first round, but I could certainly see a fun fit there as they try and keep that offense rolling with it. With a strong backfield has always been an important part of maximizing Kirk Cousins.
You mentioned the Vikings, and they've been tied, at least not tied, rumored, whatever you want to say, to quarterback just in general. Maybe one of the falling quarterbacks, or maybe Hendon Hooker, who oddly could play a big role on day one of the draft, which is 8 days away, assuming you're listening to this on a Wednesday. Let's go there next. Let's talk about Hendon Hooker and some of these other top quarterbacks on Locked On NFL. All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Lorin Cox. Do you think Hendon Hooker goes round one? Because there's some round one smoke, and I know he's an older prospect and he's coming off of the injury, but you listen to Daniel Jeremiah, he's been on it for months, and it's not just him now. It seems like some of these teams are interested in potentially taking him, and given the quarterback market, which we saw earlier this week with Jalen Hurts, getting that 5th-year option on any quarterback is probably more valuable than nabbing him, say, at 37th overall and being faced with a tough decision down the line, assuming you get the pick right.
Yeah, that's the key for me with Hooker being drafted in the first round. It's that, to me, it's less like, I'm not sure that a team is going to take him, even as early as like the teens, like Tampa Bay at 19, for example, or if Seattle doesn't go quarterback at the beginning, if they want to get a long-term option there, like, I don't know that even the Vikings at 23 feels like, that feels early to take somebody like Hendon Hooker, but could either, the Vikings trade down to the late first round, or what I'm thinking more likely, a team trades up to 30 to 31. One of these teams at the bottom of the first round look at this draft class and says, we kind of get into this tier of prospects after the 20s where it's like the difference between the guys that are going to go late first and early second probably isn't all that extreme. The only real value for you then is the 5th-year option, and it's probably more valuable for a team to get that for a quarterback than it would be for a lot of other positions. So I could see a team trading up to that range to get him just because of the quarterback premium, but I don't think he should be a first-round player. I don't think he's a first-round caliber quarterback. He strikes me as a guy that, a team takes there with the hopes and to try and develop him, but to me, it doesn't, there's enough of those question marks about, certainly just consistency when you add on to the injury and the age prospect. Like there's a lot there to have to work through. And I'm not super sold. Like if he was really this developmental prospect that you really believed in, he'd be a top 10 type of pick. But when you start getting these like guys who really need a lot of work and you get down in like the late first, early second round, it tends to be a lot more of a swing for the fences that I'm not sure Hooker quite justifies.
Yeah. Let's say you got that 5th-year option. He's 30. Just to give you an idea, which is just, it's kind of wild. And it's not much different. Will Levis is 23, versus 25. But so when you do like, it's only a year or two, but that's a huge year or two when you're talking about quarterbacks and just how it goes. Yeah, it's a quarterback-driven league. Would not shock me. Do you buy, just to continue the quarterback conversation, the C.J. Stroud, he's falling smoke? Like the Texans aren't going to take him, and a lot of people had penciled him in, and he could fall to the Colts. Some have said, he might fall past that. There are fallers. It hasn't shot, it has not been one of these things that is unprecedented. We've seen quarterbacks fall. Do you think Stroud could be the next guy? Hooker, obviously, if he goes round 1, that will surprise some. On the flip side, I think it would surprise some if C.J. Stroud wasn't the second pick, and there's at least some smoke that that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, it seems like this happens every so often with quarterbacks, and I certainly I'm old enough to remember the last Ohio State quarterback that was supposed to go at the top of the draft and fell, fortunately, all the way to 11, where the Bears were able to trade up and go get him. But it does strike me that like C.J. Stroud is the most boring of these top quarterbacks in the sense that like he doesn't have the flashy arm, or he doesn't have some of these high end physical tools that you love, but he's just he's smart and sees the field well and is consistent and productive, and like you can see where at the top of the draft, teams tend to fall in love with the tools, the skill sets, the high end ability. And if we're already sort of accepting Bryce Young as the number 1 pick, then it becomes, well, do you want the sexy pick of Anthony Richardson being the big, fast, strong, physical specimen at the quarterback spot? Or do you want CJ Stroud, who's just like smart and seems to be well put together and can see the field well and do all the little things that you want at the quarterback spot? Like for me, that's kind of what I would tend to prefer, but NFL teams get bigger and grander ideas, and coaches see the clay that is some of these bigger armed quarterbacks and feel like, oh, I can make him into something special. I certainly don't think Stroud's going to like free fall into the mid first round by any means, but I could easily see that happening to 4. I think the Texans are just a massive wild card at this stage. And if quarterbacks start to fall a little bit, then teams maybe don't feel as much of a pressure to make sure they have to trade up and get one of these guys. And so then if Arizona stays there, you can start to build this narrative of the quarterbacks dropping a little bit and eventually them getting into a closer range for some of the later quarterback needy teams that we were talking about to then be able to move up. Because I don't think Tampa at 19 is in a great spot to move up to the top 4 of this draft to take a quarterback. But if that QB falls to 9 or 10 or 11, could they be in a much better position to move up that far? And then that's where I think the free fall ends as soon as the mid to late round quarterback needy teams get into a good trade up range where they don't have to leverage their entire future draft capital to still get a good quarterback.
I agree with that. I think it's interesting to me. I can't see Stroud falling past 4. I think Indy is in on quarterback. They've played, for lack of a better term, with all of these different veterans. And I just think Jim Irsay is like, nope, we are finding our quarterback. We get it. They're all flawed. Let's find the best one. Bryce Young isn't there. All right, who's there? And so what is going to be interesting then, and you mentioned it, is Arizona. If the Texans pass on Stroud, if I'm Arizona, I'm like, all right, here we go. The Colts are going to take him. Who's going to do it? The Colts are going to take him. And if I'm a team that wants Stroud, I would assume the Colts are going to take him, unless you just have it on great authority that that's not going to be the case. Anthony Richardson is such a roll of the dice. Talk to any Florida fan that just watched him. It's not, you don't have to do this deep dive. You don't have to read this you literally talk to a Florida Gators fan. They're like, well, yeah, he's gifted. He's just raw. And he was last year. Like, he's not Cam Newton. We know what Cam Newton did at Auburn. That was not last year's Florida team. And that was not Anthony Richardson. So to me, if Stroud goes 4 and you're a team that's interested in him, maybe the Raiders or whoever, you have to get to 3. So I still think we'll see a trade. I don't buy all of this falling smoke. Maybe it is, some of these teams hoping that he falls some, but it's going to be interesting because I think of all these guys, Will Levis could fall. Like Richardson, yeah. I wouldn't call him a huge faller anyway, because I just think he is more of a project. Like if he falls, well, not many people had him as a top 5 pick before the combine anyways. And he just blew the combine up. But Will Levis, people have been on. I could see him falling.
Yeah. I wonder if we find ourselves like with some recency bias from the 2021 draft where, Zach Wilson and Trey Lance go 2nd and 3rd as sort of these like, big armed, high upside with athletes. I mean, obviously Lance a little bit more of a runner, but Wilson with a little more of a cannon there. And like, we think, oh, well, now teams are always falling in love with these big armed, high upside athletes. So therefore somebody like Stroud might fall. But I was like going back through other drafts around that. We really haven't seen that be a bigger picture trend. I wonder how much that was just exclusive to that draft class in particular and the different quarterback dynamics there. Because otherwise, like Josh Allen in 2018 fell to 7, and that wasn't considered like a fall for him, but like that's more the range, right? The the toolsy quarterbacks with questions fall outside of the top 5, and the more sure things are the ones that go in the top 5. And that's where it feels like Young and Stroud are more in that top 5 group, and the Levis Richardson is more in the top 10 group. And that's where it feels like maybe this range might be good time to be a Las Vegas Raiders fan. I think they might be in a good spot here to get one of those quarterbacks without having to give up to get a bunch of them.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Anthony Richardson makes sense there because you sit him behind Jimmy Garoppolo and you let him learn from Josh McDaniels. You hired McDaniels for a reason. Maybe you could make that work and have Jimmy G start for a season or two. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Make sure that you follow Lorin Cox on Twitter at CoxSports1. Lorin, I appreciate you filling in for Tony Wiggins. You crushed it as always. You've been clutch coming in for either me with my crazy schedule over the past few months or Tony. So I really appreciate you.
Hey, anytime. I can't possibly fill Tony's shoes, but I can fill his barber chair and let him cut my hair anytime.
That's right. He owes me a cut. So he owes you a cut too, for sure, for filling in. So
no offense, but I need it a little more than you do right now.
I just got one. Yeah, that's true. I just got one. So that's going to do it for us. Thanks so much for listening to Locked On NFL. For Lorin Cox, I'm James Rapien. We'll talk to you next time.